Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Spectre. The way people will talk about Spectre and the way people will perceive Spectre has a lot to do with how they perceive James Bond or how they feel James Bond movies should be. But more so than that, how this doesn't really live up to Skyfall. Now, if you know anything about James Bond films and how uneven they are in terms of quality from one installment to the next, then you know there was a good chance that this was not going to be as good as Skyfall. It didn't matter that they got Sam Mendes back, they didn't get Roger Deakins back, but it didn't matter because that's pretty par for the course with this franchise, particularly if the third one is really good, much like with Connery and Roger Moore. The fourth one is usually kind of a letdown or a lesser effort. That doesn't mean this is a bad movie. It's not a bad movie. It's not a bad Bond movie. It's kind of an average Bond movie, but there's nothing really wrong with that. I think people's expectations were a little too high. But the other thing with the Daniel Craig films that happened with Casino Royale to Quantum of Solace and then Skyfall and Spectre, when the first film comes out, everybody loved Casino Royale, but then when Quantum of Solace came out, which is not a great movie, it's still probably the worst of the four, so don't worry. People started complaining like, hey, where are the gadgets? Where's all the funny lines? Why is this so dark and brooding? And yet when Casino Royale came out, that was part of what people liked about it. And Quantum of Solace, not a good movie, but to bring up that as a problem, you should bring those kind of things up with Casino Royale. Now you can say, oh, well, that didn't really work in Quantum of Solace. And so because it didn't work, Skyfall is more returning to the Goldfinger kind of structure that most Bond films have. With Daniel Craig's run, as soon as one movie changes as a reaction, as all Bond movies are, they're reactions to the previous film, and they try to take what's popular and integrate it into the Bond franchise. And so Spectre is really a follow-up from Skyfall. It's continuing the gadgets. Q is back. Daniel Craig's a lot funnier than he was in the previous Bond films. He's a lot quippier, more of a fun Bond movie than more serious and dark Bond movie. And so now people are complaining about that. How has this Bond become the kind of thing that Bond was rebooted for in the first place? And to complain about that with Spectre, I think is a little silly because obviously that transition was already occurring in Skyfall. Now, that doesn't make up for problems with the plot and the structure of this movie. There are other problems this film has. Just bringing those kind of things up, you're missing the point of the actual problems, much like with Quantum of Solace. So when the next Bond film of Daniel Craig's in it or whoever is dark and serious, we'll all know why. In the franchise of Bond, if you're not looking at it like whoever the best is and looking at it as an ever-evolving franchise and you know the rules of how each subsequent entry will always work out, then Spectre isn't a bad movie. It's just an average kind of typical Bond film, and that is a little deflating after you've had one of the greatest Bond films ever made and one of the biggest hits and one of the most acclaimed Bond films to come along and blow everyone out of the water. To see more of just a typical Bond film starring Daniel Craig doesn't feel as thrilling as it does when he makes a great one, but that doesn't mean it's a bad movie. James Bond is in Mexico to assassinate this one arch villain, and MI6 is all upset with him because he went rogue and did this as they're trying to set up this global surveillance community and try to get rid of the 00 program because it's obsolete. But Bond is still trying to figure out, after he was given a clue by M, Judi Dench's M, not Ralph Fiennes' M, there's two M's, it's confusing, but she sent a video from beyond the grave, spoilers, she died in Skyfall. She told Bond to take out this guy in Mexico and to go to this guy's funeral, and he does go and starts to figure out about an evil organization named Spectre and how they're behind all these nefarious things, and Bond is trying to figure out what exactly Spectre is up to and going through various ways and eventually finding the daughter of the villain from Quantum of Solace so they can both figure out what's going on with Spectre and how to find it and eventually take it down before he becomes irrelevant and taken out from MI6. This is a hard movie to talk about because there's a lot of kind of spoilery stuff about this movie that I don't want to spoil for you. So I'm just going to talk about what I can talk about, and then there'll be a spoiler section for everyone who has. But if you haven't, you can still get a review. If you look at how fourth films work, this film falls into the tradition. Fourth Bond films are always ridiculously expensive. There's a certain sequence where Bond's talking to a fellow agent on a boat, and I was thinking, like, couldn't they have just walked down a hallway? Like, is this really necessary? And it felt like there are a couple, not too often, there's some really cool stuff. There's an amazing tracking shot that starts off this film that I didn't even realize was a tracking shot at first. It might not actually be a tracking shot. There's probably cuts in there. And it looks very Birdman-esque, and there were actually cuts in there. They didn't actually do those longer takes. They just digitally found ways to put cuts in. So maybe it's not, but it looks like an amazing tracking shot, and they did an amazing job in that opening sequence. There's an amazing car chase. There's some great fights with Dave Bautista, who does an all-time great James Bond henchman role. Dave Bautista knows how to use his personality and his physical presence to get it to work in this film. I think he says one line in this whole movie, but he's absolutely perfect. This film is the kind of Bond film where you can sit back, have a beer, and go, well, that's Bond. There's a lot of times where it just kind of does things where you're like, yeah, I mean, that's what they're supposed to do, and then doesn't really earn them, particularly with the romance he's having with Leah Seydoux or whatever, the French girl in this. And there's a lot of things like that, but if you know the structure and format of Bond movies, you kind of just can go with it. I didn't even really start to think about it until later. The thing with Bond films is if while you're watching it, it makes sense, that's pretty good. If you start questioning their logic while it's going on, that's not really good. Most of them, if you think about it later, you're like, wait, hold up, what? And while I was watching Spectre, I didn't have that many problems with it. I thought it was an enjoyable, fun Bond movie, and I was surprised how good of a time I had. This film not only is a reaction to a lot of the Skyfall stuff, which I can't get into until the spoiler stuff, but I will say it uses some MCU or the Marvel Cinematic Universe influence in this film that might seem boring because a million blockbusters try to do that and try to acting like they're all connected and whatnot. But is that really inappropriate or feels like a paint-by-numbers kind of blockbuster thing when it comes to Bond? Bond movies are supposed to do this. When Star Wars was big, they do Moonraker. When Blaxploitation was big, they do Live and Let Die. When parkour was big, they do Casino Royale. When Christopher Nolan is a huge deal, they make Skyfall. So when you look at Spectre and they're using MCU in James Bond, that makes absolute perfect sense. They do what the big Hollywood thing is at the time, and they have it influence Bond films. It makes too much sense that they were going to do that. We all knew they were going to do that. Do they do it in a great way? Not really, but I always knew it probably wouldn't be amazing or anything. It wasn't going to do more with it. I think Skyfall does that with Nolan, but Spectre doesn't really do that as well, but they definitely bring it in there, but that's to be expected. This was not shot by Roger Deakins. This was shot by Hoyt van Hoytema, who is a great DP, actually. He shot Interstellar, but most notably, he shot Let the Right One In, and he's definitely one of the top DPs going right now. Hoyt van Hoytema did do an amazing job. It's interesting that one of the things that gets people to see these newer James Bond films since Deakins started is now cinematography. That cinematography is as much of a star to see this in IMAX as it is that the thrills and the action sequences. That's pretty fucking cool. Sam Mendes always lets his DPs run wild, and Hoyt van Hoytema took advantage of that. I'm going to have to move on to the spoiler section, but if you're interested in seeing Spectre, it is kind of an average, kind of typical kind of a Bond film. It doesn't altogether work, but for the most part, for an enjoyable, fun time at the movies kind of Bond film, it works very well. I don't think you'll be totally disappointed. This is not Quantum of Solace. I think this doesn't reach the heights of Daniel Craig's other two great classic Bond films, Casino Royale and Skyfall, but it's still a decent enough Bond film. This is one in the Bond filmography that you're not going to put at the bottom, but you're not going to put at the top, but it's going to be somewhere in between, and you'll be like, yeah, that one was fine, and I had a good enough time. And really, Bond films are fantasies. I know we all want them to mean more. I know we want them to be darker and deeper and represent something. Bond films don't represent really anything. They're fun, fantasy, action-adventure, big-budget, blockbuster type of movies, and Spectre follows suit within that. If you're looking at this film in a pure Bond film, what does this film give me as a Bond film? I think it succeeds for the most part on a very basic material level, and there's nothing really wrong with that. And that's what you're looking for Spectre. I really doubt you'd be disappointed. So thank you very much for watching. If you haven't seen Spectre, if you have, you can continue on to the spoiler section. See, it says spoilers right here. Don't ruin the movie for yourself. That's super lame. The two biggest things that influence this film are the two biggest blockbuster things that happened post-Nolan. J.J. Abrams and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, both which are used in Spectre, while also being a reaction to Skyfall. Now, the overarching thing that Spectre is behind all the various other movies and stuff, because it's kind of a retcon from what was Quantum from Quantum of Solace, and Casino Royale is now Spectre. Basically, Bond movies retcon continuity all the time, so that's not surprising. It does feel like a weaker Hollywood film trying to act like they had all this continuity and didn't, but the Daniel Craig Bond films have had a certain amount of continuity, so this kind of works, but it did feel predictable. But the J.J. Abrams things is this film does do the mystery box thing, and the mystery box is stupid, because the problem with the mystery box is every time you're like, I think it's this thing, and then J.J. Abrams in interviews will be like, no, it's not this thing. It is so different, you don't even know. And then you see the movie and go, oh, it was that thing. It's very lame. It's very annoying. What was the exact reason in the story you hid this from me? And there isn't one. And the whole thing with Christoph Waltz's character, which is originally Franz Obenhauser, but then is revealed to be Blofeld. When it's revealed, it is like, why didn't you just tell us it was Blofeld? It didn't really add to anything. And the whole thing with the surveillance stuff that Spectre was going to take power of, certainly that's really evil and bad if they had an alliance with MI6 and were being able to surveil all of the world and all the evil they could do with that. But it doesn't feel Bond enough for the kind of Bond that they're doing. It feels like we're mixing a dark and serious kind of idea, but we want to do more of a Roger Moore-ish kitschy gadgety Bond, which kind of usually has like a laser in space. And sure, like the surveillance stuff is evil, but I feel like there's something, not just an idea of evil, that other evil they're going to create. It has to be like an actual thing. Like we have nuclear warheads, or I really just wish they had, oh, and I'm doing all the surveillance because I'm gonna have a missile in space, or like something like that would have fit a little better. It just didn't feel like the whole point of why he wants to try to get Spectre. It felt evil, but it didn't feel evil enough, and the resolution didn't feel Bond and epic enough. In Skyfall, it worked because the whole idea was he's attacking Bond personally and M personally, and that's the point of the villain, so he was a different type of villain. But Blofeld is not a different type of villain. Blofeld is fucking Blofeld. Christoph Waltz, when you hear he's cast in a Bond movie as the main villain, that's amazing. He's perfect casting, especially for Blofeld. Christoph Waltz is almost kind of wasted. They don't use him like Javier Bardem was. That might be a reaction because Javier Bardem's character was in so much of Skyfall and was such a big deal in Skyfall that maybe the overreaction was the thing that most people complain about with Bond films and even Batman movies, is that it becomes more and more about the villains and the gadgets and things like that. So why don't we make it more about Bond than the villains and the gadgets? But that almost kind of didn't work for this movie. That was an odd reaction to have because you have Blofeld, like this is a big moment. You have Spectre back, like do something with it. And it didn't feel like they really did enough. The other thing, and this is kind of a reaction I understand, Bond has this one structure, and it started with Goldfinger where he has sex with some girl who works for the bad guy, and then after Bond gets information from her, the bad guy kills that girl, and then Bond's suddenly offended and really cares, has extra incentive to get this bad guy. And in Skyfall, that one girl gets just killed and he kind of just doesn't care, and it breaks from a structure that had been in the Bond franchise since Goldfinger and had been a well-honored tradition of him pretending like he was totally going to marry this girl, but we knew he wasn't. And in this film, certainly Monica Bellucci kind of plays that role that normally early in the film that you would do that, but nothing happens. And then his relationship with Leah Sedux, I think Seydoux or whatever, that whole thing feels like very much a reaction to what happened in Skyfall, and that Bond very much cares about her and they have a relationship. They try to act like she's more developed, but their relationship doesn't feel developed. There's not enough there to really get you on their side of their romance. They just kind of fall in love, and she did a decent enough job with the material, and I thought her acting was okay. It's just there's not much to do with the script at times. That relationship doesn't exactly echo as well as it probably should throughout the film. It's a nice idea, but poorly executed. It's a reaction to Skyfall and trying to do similar things that Skyfall did, like maybe we shouldn't have 00 agents anymore. Maybe he's outdated. That felt a bit of a repeat, but I did like how they used Moneypenny and Q and M are all working together. It felt very much like Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. There are certain parts that felt like a team, and Bond was on it as well. With Spectre, I wasn't disappointed while I was watching it, but the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah, I don't know. A lot of people are really getting upset about this movie and saying like, why are we getting the same things that we complained about the Bond franchise for? But the Bond franchise is the Bond franchise, and it's always going to be that, and it's always going to try to do what a Bond movie should do. It eventually will come back to that. Always. And Spectre is just doing what the Bond franchise does and getting back to that. A third Bond movie will begat a fourth Bond movie, and they do the things they're supposed to do. And Spectre feels like the circle of life in terms of Bond film. And it feels a little typical, it feels traditional, but it feels like kind of what I'd expect. And so I'm not really let down so much. I think the ending and parts with the resolution aren't the best built of any Bond film. I think those are a little weak, and it does kind of take moments that a bunch of other blockbusters did, but that's more natural for Bond. That's what Bond's always done. So we are probably going to get upset about that, but that's just par for the course for Bond. The other thing with Spectre is the serious Bond was more of a post 9/11 Bourne thing, and that style is dying out. It does not represent the times as much as it did when Casino Royale came out. So we're really moving past that. So in a lot of ways, Spectre makes sense. Now, plot-wise, it doesn't, and the ending isn't great, but just the evolution of the franchise and where they are, you can't make Casino Royale in 2015. I think what it's doing is trying to evolve the franchise and have it keep being Bond the way people want it to be, and people are ready for more of a sillier, lighter Bond movie than they were in 2006. Now, they're ready for something like this. They could have done a better job with it, but that kind of, for me, explains why we got the kind of movie we're getting and why it's more fun and silly. It just wasn't an exceptional version of that, but that's why it was a version of that. And under the guise of Bond and the franchise and how the formats for Bond work and everything like that, why Spectre makes a lot of sense. It's just the execution of Spectre that you can put into question. So if you have seen Spectre and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And I've actually reviewed all the fourth Bond movies of all the actors who've had a fourth Bond movie, and this is the fourth time anyone's tenure of James Bond has led them to a fourth Bond movie. So I did Connery's fourth Thunderball, Roger Moore's fourth Moonraker, Pierce Brosnan's fourth Die Another Day, and now Spectre. You can check those out in my James Bond review playlist. There'll be an annotation below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.